Hi, welcome back to my channel and to the books that I read in February. So February wasn't actually a great reading month. I didn't get through as many books as I wanted. It was actually a very busy, hectic, stressful month at work and at home. And it just meant that I wasn't able to make as much time as I'd hoped. But also when I was reading, my mind wasn't fully on everything that I was doing. So I got through 5 books, and in terms of ratings, they all actually did quite well. But I definitely feel like it could have been a better month. So I'm still quite busy. I've got a lot of stuff going on today actually, so I don't have a huge amount of time to film and edit this. So I'm just going to try and get through talking about these books as quickly as possible. So I had one 4-star read in February, and that was The Defence by Steve Kavanagh. This was actually the last book that I read in the month, and this was the one that I read kind of in the busiest period, where I definitely feel like this book suffered because my concentration level was a little bit off. So in this book, we have Eddie Flynn as the main character. He is a former con man turned lawyer, but he still uses his skills as a con man. So he is able to look at people and see their habits, their mannerisms, the way they say things, their body language. But something happened to him about a year ago, and he's basically had this massive crisis of confidence where he's given up being a lawyer. His wife has left him, he barely has any contact with his daughter, and then he gets picked up at the side of the road and is confronted by the head of the Russian mafia in New York, who basically tells him that his daughter's been kidnapped, and unless he helps this man in court, his daughter's going to be killed. That isn't really a spoiler. It's all on the back of the book. It's there. I'm not a massive fan of books about the mob, the mafia, gangland criminals, that sort of thing. It doesn't float my boat. It's not my thing. I think this book was well written. I thought the main character, Eddie, was interesting because he's completely unreliable. He's not particularly very nice. He has a lot of flaws. So there are times where you just feel like he's brought everything on himself. He's not a very sympathetic character. It's quite hard to feel sorry for him. There aren't actually any likeable characters in this book. They're all out for themselves. They're all threatening each other in some way. I did think it was well paced. It's a thriller, and there were some twists. The main sort of twist at the end, the revelation, I didn't see coming, which I liked. I just think that because of other stuff that was going on, I wasn't fully able to enjoy this. It took me longer to read this than it should have. It's only a little over 300 pages, and it took me around about a week to read it, which, when I get to that stage in a book where it's becoming a little bit of a chore to get through, it really drops my enjoyment of a book. So I gave this 4 stars, but I don't feel as though it's the book's fault. I think there were certain areas that I didn't love. As I say, the whole sort of mafia thing doesn't really do it for me anyway. And there were a couple of characters where I kind of forgot where they sat in amongst the kind of groups of people and the plot in general. But overall, I thought it was well paced, The characters were interesting. It was an interesting concept, although the whole sort of kidnapped daughter thing has been done to death. It's, a little bit boring. But I think in terms of the first book from the series, it was interesting, and I would be interested to read the next book just to see where this series goes. So I then had 2 4.5-star books, and the first one was Misery by Stephen King. This has always been and will always be one of my favourite books, one of my favourite Stephen King books. Annie Wilkes for me is the ultimate female horror character. I love this woman. There is only one negative for me where this book is concerned, and that is the book within the book aspect. That happens way too often, and it goes on for way too long. If you are listening to the audiobook, it's actually really difficult to skip those parts as well, because apart from the fact that the narrator puts on an accent, it's really difficult to tell that you are reading the book within the book, and you have absolutely no idea for how long it's going to go on for. With the physical copy, it's done in a different font, and if you want to skip it, you can skip it, and it really doesn't do anything for the actual plot involving Annie and Paul. So if you're not familiar, we have Paul Sheldon, who is an author. He is in a car crash. He's just finished writing his latest novel. He's in a car crash and he gets rescued by his biggest fan, who is Annie Wilkes. She is a former nurse. She has a incredible backstory, which we do find out about. Paul basically wakes up in her house and she has no plans to let him go. She essentially nurses him, but to a point where she actually turns him into a major drug addict. She completely incapacitates him. There are scenes in this that if you're squeamish, you might not be able to actually finish, but I absolutely love it. It's really a two-hander. So Annie and Paul are basically the only characters in this. A couple of other people show up later on, but essentially this is a book about 2 people. This is the ultimate isolated horror. And it's just brilliant. The characters are fantastic. The pacing is brilliant. The plot itself is absolutely fantastic. And it's kind of embedded itself in pop culture and just people's psyche. Everybody knows the story of Misery. Even if they haven't actually read the book or seen the film, they kind of know about it. When you hear people talk about being #1 fans, this is kind of what ended up in your head. I absolutely love this book, and I think even though it was written over 30 years ago, it really holds up, and it actually has a relevance nowadays with the whole social media, everybody following celebrities. You only have to go on Instagram, and if you follow authors, actors, musicians, you only have to look at some of the comments to realise that there are thousands of Annies out there. But I think Annie is one of my favourite characters ever. Misery is one of the best books ever. I love it, and I enjoy it every single time I read it. So the next 4.5-star read was Carved in Bone by Jefferson Bass. Now, Jefferson Bass is the pseudonym of John Jefferson and Bill Bass. and they are a documentary filmmaker and forensic anthropologist who basically joined up and started writing a series. This is all based around a real life location known as the Body Farm in Mississippi in the US. But what they do is they look at the different variables of decomposition that can happen to a body in different circumstances. So whether it's been left out in the open, whether it's been buried, where it's been buried, the different types of soil and clay and sand and all sorts of things, whether it's been stored somewhere, there are different places that you can store a body, whether it's been in water, whether it's been burned, whether anything that can happen to a human body before or after death that can lead investigators and police to discover how the person died, whether or not it was murder, and then who did it. It is fascinating. I did really enjoy this book. There are a couple of little things. I got lost a little bit with some of the characters. I forgot who was who and where they fitted in and what they were doing and things like that. And I guessed the ending. I wasn't displeased about. It was fine. It didn't happen too early on, so that was okay. And yeah, I was quite pleased that I'd figured it out. What I loved about this book, though, were all of the scenes involving the decomposing bodies and all of the information regarding the Body Farm. The details, the descriptions. I mean, it's gruesome, it's gory, it's disgusting, but absolutely fascinating. As somebody who was never very good at science and stuff in school, I am still fascinated by this stuff. I'm absolutely just... I find it incredible that forensics and this sort of thing has come on so much over the decades. And I think the people who work in these areas are amazing. What they do is amazing. And I'm just insanely jealous that my brain was never able to fully sort of compute and understand and be able to do all this stuff. But I love reading about it. I love it. And I think overall it was a fascinating book. So in terms of the actual plot, they basically find a corpse in a cave, and firstly they need to figure out who it is, then they need to figure out how they died, and then it's basically working out, was it murder and who killed them. Obviously this is a crime thriller, so it was murder. But it's in this kind of small town community where nobody really talks to outsiders, but also there's a bit of rivalry between certain people, so they automatically try to direct suspicion onto each other. This is also the first book in a series, and it left me really, really intrigued. So I am definitely going to read the next book to see what happens at the Body Farm. And then the last two books that I read were 5 stars. So the first one was the non-fiction book that I read, and this is Death's Acre, and this is by Bill Bass and John Jefferson. So those two. And this is where they talk about the setting up, the running of, and the difficulties that the Body Farm has had over the years. This basically goes through the history of this facility, and it is fascinating. There are detailed descriptions about corpses and crime scenes and scenes of accidental deaths and all sorts of things. So if you are squeamish, if you don't like reading about dead bodies and corpses and different levels of decomposition, then this book probably isn't for you. I thought it was absolutely fascinating, fantastic. It's written in a really easy to understand way. The language is really simple. There are obviously scientific phrases and terminology, but it's all explained. So you learn what the people in the forensics and police investigations would call things, but then it's sort of given the layman explanation. So you know what everything means, you know what things are. So there are things where you might have heard it on TV and not known what it is. This tells you. I really loved this book. Absolutely fascinated. And really enjoyed it. And then the final book that I read in February was the 5-star read. And this was The Bone Collector by Jeffrey Deaver. I mentioned this in my February TBR that I had actually read this before, but a really long time ago, basically when it first came out in the late 90s. And I'll admit that I didn't actually remember a huge amount about this as I was reading it, which is kind of a good thing, because actually it was like reading it again for the first time. This is really good. This is a proper crime thriller. So we have a serial killer who is kidnapping people, killing them in a variety of different ways, torturing them. It's horrendous. And it is up to Lincoln Rhyme. He is a paraplegic former forensics investigator who worked for the New York Police Department. And he gets paired up with a New York police officer called Emilia Sachs. And she kind of inspires him to get back to doing what he does best. He's kind of spent some time feeling a bit sorry for himself, is basically planning his own suicide, assisted suicide. He wants to try and find somebody to help him die. He's just kind of had enough of being stuck in this bed, unable to move anything other than his face and one finger. But he meets her and he realises that actually he can sort of train her to become a really good investigator and somebody who is brilliant at crime scene analysis and collection of evidence and things like that. And so they start working together on this case, and it's brutal, it's violent, it's disturbing, it's very detailed in places. So the descriptions of the torture, the methods of killing, the conditions of the bodies afterwards, it's pretty grim reading, but it is so well done. The characters are all great. The pacing is brilliant. This is really fast paced. I really enjoyed this book and cannot wait to continue with the series. So they were the books that I read in February. If you have read any of them, let me know. Let me know what you read in February. What was your favourite book? Did you give anything 5 stars? And I will be back with another video soon. Bye.